DiscerningHearts.com presents Hope in Difficult Times with St. Therese and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher. This series of programs is a special presentation of the retreat conducted by Father Timothy Gallagher, which features the lives of St. Therese of Lisieux, Saints Louis and Zelie Martin, servant of God Leonie Martin, and the entire Martin family. We now begin Conference 2.
All right, let's pick right up again with the letters. I listened, in preparation for this, I listened to all those podcasts that I did with Chris on St. Therese and Leonie, and I realized I say all right a lot. Well, what's that? That's all right. That's all right. All right. Okay, so we're this letter of Zelie to her brother. This is April 23rd, 1865. So we're 2 years later than the first letter that we read, and this is 6 weeks after the last letter that we read. Hastily, I'm writing you a few words because I'm unable to write you a long letter. I have a violent headache. In fact, she suffered from migraine headaches. Understandably, given the pace of life she was living and the stress that she was carrying. And I'm up against constant aggravation. Moreover, we have my father-in-law. So this is Louis' father, who also was a soldier in earlier life and is close to death. In fact, he will die 2 months after this letter. And he is now with them in the home, and she is taking care of him. Because she had so many demands on her time, especially as the family got larger and the business grew, they eventually hired a maid to be with Zelie and to assist her with all of this work. And it's quite conceivable that the maid was also helping with this. That brought its blessings, but it also brought some grave issues that emerged later on. So let's see, he's 88 years old at this point, who is near death. I don't think he'll live another 2 weeks. He's dying of old age, and already half his body is paralyzed. And now she turns to the children. Little Leonie, so that's her third, is doing well now, as well as the other three. So she's overcome that crisis that could have taken her life and the eczema. 2 weeks ago, I went to see Celine, so the one who is with the wet nurse, that is Rose Taillet, who is that 6 miles distant. I can't remember ever having felt such an intense feeling of happiness as at the moment when I took her in my arms. In fact, the times that Zelie expresses joy, and it's deep joy, as you see in this case, it always has to do with family. Her children, probably above all, certainly rejoicing in her brothers doing well. She gets very close to her sister-in-law, her brother's Isidore's wife. And here she says it. I can't ever remember ever having felt such an intense feeling of happiness as at the moment when I took her in my arms and she smiled at me so graciously. Just remembering, if I can share a personal thing here, I'm from a large family. And I remember my mother saying to me once, of course, the baby keeps you up at night. It does all the things that the baby does. But she says, all the baby has to do is smile at you with that smile that is only for the mother. And it's all worth it. Zelie would not agreement to that. That's what she's expressing here. I believed I was looking at an angel. As I've said, everyone loved Celine. There was a sweetness and a goodness. She was just pretty as a young child, but there was a goodness that won everyone's heart. Well, I can't express it. I believe we've never seen, nor will ever see, a little girl so charming. My little Celine, when will I have the happiness of possessing her completely? That is, when will she be able to return home and live together with her mother and the family? I can't imagine that I have the honor of being the mother of such a delightful creature. Oh, I admit I don't regret being married. And what you're getting there is there was that longing in her for religious life. And what reconciled her to the fact that God was calling her to marriage was her children and just the love that was there. And it's all worth it because I have these children. Um, if you had seen the two older ones today, so that's Marie and Pauline, how pretty they looked. Everyone was admiring them, and I could not take my eyes off of them. And me, I was there beaming. I said to myself, they're mine. And I have two others who are not here, so that's Zelie and Louis. One beautiful, that's Celine, and one less beautiful, that's Leonie. The other Martin sisters all had the feminine attractiveness, but Leonie didn't. She was plain. And it caused her a lot of suffering until the latter stages of her life when things would begin to go a different way. And one less beautiful that I love as much as the others, but she won't honor me as much. For the first time, you have to say, I don't think you're right on that, Zelie. That daughter, who won't honor you as much, her cause of canonization is now underway. And she is known, throughout the church, and that's simply going to grow as time goes by. You see, I know I said this when Chris and I were going through the podcasts. One of the reasons why it's so helpful for us to get to know the saints. I remember hearing a homily by Archbishop Chaput once where he said, I forget exactly, it was something like this: you always be reading the life of a saint or the writings of a saint. The reason, amongst many others, why it's so helpful is because I imagine there is not one of us here who cannot nod agreement to the joys and sufferings and struggles and worries and anxieties that we're seeing as we go through these letters. And we don't know the end of the story, but in the saint we do. And we see what God can do, which gives enormous hope as we go through that journey without yet seeing the end, but seeing it in others who have walked this before us and how their faith, their prayer, their love for God has seen them through. It's enormously encouraging for us. And now she refers to her own health. Let's speak of more serious things. You know that when I was a young girl, I hit my breast on the corner of a table. We didn't think anything of it then, but today I have a gland in my breast that worries me. So we're getting the first echoes of what's going to develop over the next years. And she's sharing this with Isidore because he's the one with medical background in the family. She never said anything to Louis until it was so evident, and finally, a doctor said something clear to her, and then she told him, and it was terrible for him. It was a real shock for him, but she did that because she just didn't want him to worry. And this is another thing, like mother, like daughter. When Thérèse has that that upsurge of blood, on that Holy Thursday night, and then again on Good Friday, and she coughs up blood, and she tells her superior, it's a sign that something serious is going on, and but she doesn't tell her sister Pauline, who in the Carmel is Sister Agnes of Jesus, and she doesn't tell her for a year. And finally, she has to share it with her because it's just so evident now. And that was very hard for her sister, who, of course, would have wanted to know, but Thérèse just doesn't want her to worry, and she knows that she will worry. And so you see it in Zelie here as well. We didn't think anything of it then, but today I have a gland in my breast that worries me, especially since it started to be a little painful. However, when I touch it, it doesn't hurt, although I feel some numbness several times a day, every day. Well, I don't know what else to say about it, but what's certain is that it's making me suffer. So in addition to everything else, care for a growing family and the business, she's also carrying this, and we just can keep that in mind as the years go by. Excuse me. Another, like mother, like daughter, nobody knew that she was carrying these things. And the same thing with Thérèse. One of the qualities, apparently from what I've read about tuberculosis, is that the face will look normal. even as the body is wasting away. And of course, she was wearing the habit. So that's really all people saw of her was her hands and her face looked normal. In fact, you look at all the pictures of Thérèse, even the last ones, she still looks healthy if you just, all you see is the face. And she never said much about it. Nobody really even knew, except the 2 or 3, her superior and so forth, a couple of her sisters, what she was suffering. In fact, some of them even said, well, why are they making such a big deal about it? And she looks fine, you know. And that's Zelie as well, too. So she asked her brother, what can I do about it? I'm quite confused. I'm not afraid of an operation. No, I'm completely willing to have it, but I don't have complete confidence in the doctors here. Alençon is just a small town. In fact, when things will be serious, close to the end, and finally there's the diagnosis that is just evident, and she will meet with a doctor in Lisieux. Her brother has her come up to Lisieux to meet with this Dr. Nota, who is a well-known surgeon and highly respected doctor. And he says to her at that point, because the question of a surgery was on the table, would they find a surgeon in Paris or someone to do this? And he says to her, earlier on, a surgery could have been possible, but at this point, a surgery is no longer possible. But you'll see through these years that this question of should I or should I not have the surgery, this will appear from time to time. And so I'm not afraid of an operation. I'm willing to do it, but she wants to know that it's a good doctor. I would like to take advantage of your stay in Paris. So he's studying in Paris. He can speak with or find connections to competent doctors there. Because you could help me a lot in this situation. There's only one thing that holds me back, and look what it is. How will my husband manage during this time? If I have the surgery and I'm away from the home and there's all the time of recovery, and here are all these children and the business, just what's going to happen? She just doesn't want to leave her husband alone with this. So I say it is always other-centered. And that's that abnegation that Pauline notes in her mother. I know nothing about the surgery. Be kind enough to tell me your thoughts on this subject as soon as possible. Louis sends you his kindest regards, and since you don't want to pursue your studies for a doctorate, so this is the point where Isidore, her brother, has decided that he's not going to pursue studies toward becoming a doctor and instead moves toward pharmacy, becoming a pharmacist. So since that's the case, Louis would like you to have a pharmacy like that of Monsieur. This R is this man, Vital Romé, who was a good friend of Louis. In fact, the whole Romé family, they were all friends. And he was the founder. Remember that photo of Louis with this group of men? It was this Vital Romé who founded that group. And Vital Romé is a pharmacist, and he has a pharmacy in Alençon, and he's ready to let it go and to sell it. And Louis kind of hopes that Isidore, when he finishes his study, will come to Alençon and purchase perhaps even that pharmacy. He would like you to have a pharmacy like that of Monsieur Vital Romé, and that very one, if it were possible. There's nothing else to tell you, but this is already enough. I, who was only going to write you a few lines. I think this is a good time to just see some images of the members of her brother's family. So this is Thérèse and her sisters, aunt and uncle, and their first cousins. And they have a large part to play in this story. So this is the Guérin family. That's Zélie's maiden name, as we've seen. Isidore is her younger brother. He's the one to whom she's writing these letters. And when he did settle in Lisieux and bought the pharmacy there, he wound up marrying the daughter of the man who had owned the pharmacy, Celine, who is, she's another one who just wins you over as you get to know her. A deep love developed between this Celine Guérin and her sister-in-law, Zelie. And in fact, she would become the next mother for the children by Zelie's request. That you have that powerful moment. It's the day before Zelie dies. She's no longer able to speak. And Isidore and his wife, Celine, are there in the room. Zelie just gazes at length at Celine, and her sister-in-law, who later describes this in a letter to her, to her nieces, the five. She said, "I understood the look. I knew what she was asking. She wanted me to be the mother for these children who now have no mother. In fact, that's why the family moved to Lisieux." So they lived in Lisieux, the Fournay pharmacy. They had three children, Jeanne and Marie. So they had two daughters who will be throughout all of this correspondence. They were playmates of the Martin girls, and there was a lot of closeness there. She also, they had a boy, Paul, who was stillborn. It's one of the I don't want to get ahead of the story. All right, so the two, they're two first cousins, and there was just a very close bond between them. That's that photograph that we've been quoting a part of. So Zelie at 26, you see Isidore is 10 years younger, her brother, and then Zelie 2 years older, Elise 2 years older than Zelie. In fact, there's a letter. So she would have been 12 when he was born, and in one of the letters, like her sister, she's kind of chiding him for not being where he ought to be in the way he's living his faith and so on. And she says, "You were very pretty as a boy. It's a pity you didn't stay like that." She says to him. So this is the oldest, Elise, who becomes Sister Marie d'Aucité in the Visitation. And then Isidore at later times in his life as a young man, the uncle of the Martin sisters, again, a little bit later, getting toward older age. And this is Celine, his wife, Zelie's sister-in-law. As I say, you can't help but like her as you get to know her. There she is in older age. And she's the only one of the all of these pictures where you get at least a little bit of a smile. Now, the reason for that is that photography in those days, the photographer needed 9 seconds to take the exposure. And that's why you always see people there's no movement in them, and the mouths are always closed. Because just try that sometime, just you can't smile for 9 seconds like that. So that's why you never see the smiles, and why everything looks very, immobile almost, because they did have to stand still for 9 seconds. But she, more than the others, you get a little bit of a smile there. Another picture of her in older age. Those are her two girls. If we have time, we'll get to a letter of Thérèse to her, and then her response. And that's Marie and Jeanne. Jeanne was the oldest, and then Marie, the youngest. She eventually became a Carmelite as well in the Carmel in Lisieux. Oh, okay. And there they are, a little bit older. Jeanne is the taller one, and then Marie, the smaller one. And then we'll see them in a later age. Jeanne was the only one of all these cousins who married. The 5 Martin sisters all entered the Carmel, and her sister, Marie, also entered the Carmel. So she's the only one that married. And she and her husband, to their great sorrow, were unable to have children. So the family really ends. You have 2 generations, and the family really ends there. Not in the eyes of God and the work of grace, obviously. It's very well known. Marie, he's a little bit older. Okay, so let's go back to the letters then. So let's see what's... All right, the next letter takes us to a year and 7 months later. In the meantime, obviously, Isidore has married Celine. He has moved to Lisieux and so forth. And Zelie is writing about, this would be her 5th child now, this little boy, Joseph Louis. And I should have a slide there. That's okay, her husband. I guess it's going to be later on. Yeah, that's this is an image of, now the MJL that you see there, What they did was, for all of the 9 children, the first name was Marie, Mary. They didn't use it except for the oldest, who was Marie, but it was always there, even for the boys. So the first name was, his name was Marie Joseph Louis. Of course, Joseph, and then Louis, his father. I imagine that's how they chose the name. And this is from an image that Thérèse put together later on. So he has been born now. He's 2 months old at this time. And again, of course, Zelie is unable to nurse himself. And so this child also goes to Semaye, to Rose Taillé, the one that we've seen before. I just came back from seeing my little Joseph. Zelie always hoped for a priest from the family. It was a deep desire of her heart, which gets fulfilled in a certain way in Thérèse later on in the story. I just came back from seeing my little Joseph. So he's with Rose Taillé. So again, 12 miles of walking. Oh, my beautiful little boy. He's so big and strong. It's impossible to wish for better. I never had a child who did so well except for Marie. Ah, if you knew how I love my little Joseph, I believe my fortune is made. Now, we don't have letters because there's a gap in the letters at this point of about 10 months. But what happens is, just 3 months after that letter that we just read, this baby dies. And so it's the first death in the family of her first son. And as I said, we can't read letters about this because there are none. And as I said, there are gaps throughout the letters, throughout the years in them. The baby died of 2 things, according to what the scholars say. This erysipelas, and I'm just going to give you descriptions that I found online. We'll let the doctors tell us more about this. And this is described as a bacterial infection of the skin's outer layers, and the symptoms are redness, pain at the affected site, fever, and chills. And just imagine Zelie seeing this in this little boy. And then secondly, enteritis. And this was a scourge they were all terribly afraid of for young children. And it did cause, there was very high infant mortality at this time. So inflammation of the small intestine may involve the stomach, gastritis, and the large intestine, colitis, viral or bacteria infection. And it's of these illnesses that this young boy dies. Yeah, as I say, we don't have letters, but we will see things later on which will show us what Zelie must be going through at this time. So for the first time, well, of course, Louis' husband has just died. They've gone through that. But this is the first of her children to die. The reason I say, well, again, I don't want to anticipate the story. All right. So this is 13 months later. Oh, kiss my sister-in-law for me. Tell her that I truly love her. And she really did. A little letter as soon as possible would make me so happy. Just, you could write a little more than you do, to her brother. 13 months later, and now her second boy is born. And this is Joseph Jean-Baptiste. So when Thérèse writes this, it's again Marie, and then Joseph, and in this case, Jean-Baptiste. Joseph Jean-Baptiste is the second of her boys. So let's see. She writes to the Isidore and Celine. On Thursday, the 19th, at 10:15 in the morning, my little Marie-Joseph Jean-Baptiste was born. He's very strong and quite lively, but I had a terrible time, and the baby was in the greatest danger. For 4 hours, I suffered the most severe pain I've ever felt. Imagine that the mothers here can understand that in a way that the rest of us cannot. Sometimes she will say of some of the births that it was easy. There was just a half hour of labor and so on, but this one was not easy. The poor little one was almost as asphyxiated, and the doctor baptized him before his birth. Now I'm perfectly fine. I got up for a little while, and I'm taking advantage of it by writing to you. So this is just 2 days after that birth. And she says, I'm fine, and I'm writing to you, and so on. You know, I wish with all my heart, my dear sister, that's how she thinks of Celine Guerin, that you'll be happier than I am, because she is pregnant at this point, and she is 1 month away from the birth of her first daughter, which will be Jeanne, that we just saw. So Zelie, who just went through this painful, difficult time, says, I hope it will be easier for you, and that you'll be happier than I am. I ask God that it be so, and that he give you a beautiful baby. I won't write more now. Soon I'll send you a longer letter. My little one has just left with the wet nurse. So again, this child goes with this Rose Taillet. Again, it's Zelie who would give anything to have the baby with her in the home and nurse the baby herself, just physically can't do it. And they know they can trust this woman, Rose. I'm afraid he won't be easy to raise. He cried from Thursday night until this morning. That is 36 hours nonstop. The wet nurse did not undress for 2 nights. She just stayed with the baby, obviously. Last night, I was so sorry to see the poor little one writhing in pain that I didn't sleep. I was crying, as was the wet nurse, who didn't want, the wet nurse has come to the Martin family home, but with the idea that she's going to take the baby with her when she goes back home, who didn't want to take him with her because she was too afraid that he would die at her house. This morning, the doctor reassured us. The baby was calm all morning long. All he did was sleep, and he was sleeping when he left this afternoon. 2 weeks later. Yesterday, I received news of my little Joseph. He's quite cute, and they have to wake him up to make him drink. He's always sleeping and hardly ever cries. I'm longing to see him very much because I'm in constant fear ever since the tragedy of his little brother. So she saw one die, and now she's just afraid it'll happen again. However, I believe that God will leave this little one with me. 6 weeks later, to her brother Isidore. And this is about her brother's business, first of all. Your last letter made me happy. However, now can you see that there's not really a thing about herself in any of this? This is all about the other family members. You know how John Paul II spoke of the law of the gift. That is, that we never become happy by insisting on my time, my plans, my projects, my way. But it's when we make the gift of ourselves to another in love that a wonderful thing happens. We become happy. And you see this lived, I'd almost want to say to its utmost in Zelie. And you will see it in a way that I can only describe as relentless in Thérèse. Thérèse, she is almost, I would say, relentlessly other-centered. Let's see. Okay, your last, let's see. However, I would like your business to do even better. So the pharmacy seems to have improved. And I won't be happy until you can tell me that each year you put 8,000 to 10,000 francs aside, which is a substantial amount. So try to write to me as soon as you're able to do this. In the meantime, here's the older sister, you must take heart and not worry. I was like you when I began my Alençon lace business, and I made myself sick over it. Now I'm much more reasonable. I worry much less and resign myself to all the unfortunate events that happen to me and may happen to me. And this is something that for me is a little bit of a puzzle in Zelie, because she will say this from time to time. I used to worry, but I don't worry so much anymore. But she does worry. She does. And she never really stops. You know, that's always part of who she is. Maybe she's just trying to encourage her brother to worry less. That's probably what's going on there. I tell myself that God allows it, and then I don't think about it anymore. 2 months later. So today I saw little Joseph. So this is Joseph Jean-Baptiste. He was sick for almost 2 weeks. He's doing much better, but he's lost a lot of weight and is not very strong. He's as pretty as a little bouquet, and he laughs heartily and joyfully until he chokes. I'd like very much for God to leave him with me. I pray and beg him for this every day. If, however, he doesn't wish it, I'll have to resign myself. The wet nurse always says to me that he's going to die, that he's like the other little Joseph. I have to go and console her. But I don't see him dying, thank God. Okay, this is 10 days later, and Celine's first child, Jean, has just been born on this day. My dear sister, we received the telegram about 9 o'clock this morning. Here at last is the little Jean so longed for. May God keep her with you, and may she be your joy. You wouldn't believe how happy I'd be if I could leave with my father, who is still living in Alençon, to go give you both a hug. Oh, if I could just go and hug you, you and the baby. You can't imagine how happy I'd be. I find him so privileged. Let's see, I envy him, but I have to resign myself to staying because there's no way of doing otherwise. When I told him, her father, the good news, my father was peacefully seated in the corner by the fire, smoking his pipe. He wasn't at all determined to leave so quickly. It took all the energy I had to sway him. Finally, I succeeded. So he's not in any major hurry to hop the train and go traveling, but Zelie convinces him. And he does go. I assume the baptism will take place tomorrow. Isidore must write me Wednesday morning to give me your news and that of your charming little Jean. As soon as you recover, I'm expecting a letter from you because you'll give me so many more details than my brother. He doesn't tell me half of what he should, and his letters are always too short. All right, a few weeks later to her brother, tell my father that we're eagerly awaiting his arrival, his return from Lisieux. Above all, little Helene, who every time she returns from class asks if her grandpa has arrived. And here's Leonie now. Leonie, this is just one little indication, is very worried about her little cousin. She made our lives miserable yesterday. All morning long, she had it in her head to leave for Lisieux, and she wouldn't stop crying. We had no peace until her father got angry and told her she couldn't go. Now, this is the gentle, patient Louis. She must have really been disrupting the house for even Louis finally to get angry and be very firm with her. The two oldest girls pester me every day, wanting to know how much time remains until summer vacation when we'll go to see you, because they would go in the summers. That was always a major thing, and spend some weeks with their cousins. And then also sometimes go to the sea. All right, 6 weeks later, to her sister-in-law. Your last letter made me very happy. I was so eager to hear from you, and I still am, because I'd like to know how little Jean is doing, as well as all of you. And now she returns to her own little baby boy, Joseph Jean-Baptiste. However, I've had plenty of reasons to be anxious over the youngest one, who was very sick 3 weeks ago. The wet nurse arrived sobbing to tell me there was no hope, that he was sick exactly like his little brother. The fear of seeing him die in her home frightened her so much that she wanted to return him to me. The doctor went there right away and saw he had bronchitis. We took care of him as best we could, and now he's completely cured. She's always hoping for the best, you know. A little bit later, we went to see him today. So she and Louis walked together these miles. He smiled at his father and me as if he knew us. I feel so deprived not having him with us, and I'm longing for the moment when he returns, although I already fear the extra problems his return will bring us because we're so overworked here. And watch how she describes this. If I had 3 times less work, I'd still have so much that I'd rarely have a free moment. That's why you get her writing these letters, at in the late evening into the very late hours of the evening. Let's see. But it's such sweet work to take care of little children. If I only had that to do, it seems to me I'd be the happiest of women. But it's quite necessary that their father and I work to earn money for their dowries. This is what I mentioned earlier. This is what's driving her relentlessly in this application to this lace making business, and that she can't let it go because she is so concerned that her daughters not have to go through what she went through. Otherwise, when they're grown, they won't be very happy with us. Everyone here is in good health, but my poor Leonie, and that's how she would always speak of Leonie, la pauvre Leonie. Her husband had a different way of speaking of her. Louis spoke of her as la bonne Leonie, the good Leonie, and that was true because they all said it. She is disruptive, unmanageable, but everybody knew that she had a heart of gold, and that's why you can go through the whole life of Leonie. Leonie never had an enemy, ever, in her life. People could get irritated with her and frustrated with her because she was so meticulous and took forever to do things that should only take a minute to do and all the rest of it, but everybody knew that she had a good heart. And that's what her father calls her la bonne Leonie. But Zelie speaks of her as here, ma pauvre Leonie. But my poor Leonie took a bad fall and has two very large and deep cuts on her forehead. This is the writing of a canonized saint. What does that say about what sanctity is? And how approachable it is. Don't have to go off to a monastery. That's one of the things that really strikes me in this whole story. And in Thérèse, you see it expressed that we don't need anything other than what we already have to become saints. We already have everything we need to love and become saints. It's all right there. And Zelie, it was just her home and her family. That's all it was. Thérèse's world was even smaller, roughly 20, 25 people in a monastery. That's all it was. Let's see. This is the third. How long have we been going? I'd like to go for about an hour. Can we do that? Okay. Can you bear another 20 minutes or so? Okay. All right. Those are called courtesy questions when you expect the answer yes. Someday somebody's going to say no. And let's see, Leonie, this is the third time she has cut her forehead, and the marks from the first two times are very noticeable. I'm sorry about that. And now she does refer to the other side of Leonie. But on the other hand, she has the best nature you could imagine. She and Pauline are charming. Little Helene is very cute as well. Marie has a very special and determined nature, and this was true throughout her life of Marie. Her father, Louis, had nicknames for each of the five of his daughters, and his nickname, because he had worked in jewelry, some of them were jewels, and so he called Marie his diamond. It's just strong, tough, and also l'intrépide, the intrepid one. And she was, she could stand her ground and be blunt and do what needed doing. And at some points along the story, that served the family very well. So she's already here as a little girl, a very special and determined nature. She is the prettiest, but I'd like her to be more obedient. When you write to me, don't mention what I say to you about this child other than being so gifted. My husband wouldn't be happy. She's his favorite. And in fact, Marie was his favorite. Later on, when Thérèse is born, she will have a very special place. All right, this is 4 months later now to Isidore, and again asking about a medical condition of her young son. I think we're again going to have the tragedy of losing little Joseph. He's very near death. This morning, Louis assured me that it would take a miracle to save him. Everybody tells me as much. He's been so much worse since Tuesday. Until then, his condition was not serious and didn't prevent him from eating or sleeping. He even seemed not to suffer because he was very cheerful and never cried. Only he didn't thrive. For the last 5 days, he's been throwing up everything he eats. I saw 2 doctors, and again, doesn't get much help. One prescribed nothing and the other not much. I believe they don't have any hope of saving him. I'm truly disheartened, and I don't even have the strength to take care of him. It tears my heart out to see a little person suffer so much. He only has a mournful cry. For 48 hours, he hasn't closed his eyes. He's doubled over with pain. When you receive this letter, he will probably be dead. So, my dear friends, if you come, because we're in the summer and they're thinking of making a visit, coming down to Alençon, if you come, you see the joy that awaits you. However, I always hope and can't imagine that God will not leave my dear little boy with me. And this next is written the following day. My dear Isidore, my dear little Joseph died this morning at 7 o'clock. I was alone with him. He had a night of cruel suffering, and tearfully I asked for his deliverance. My heart was relieved when I heard him utter his last sigh. I am for life, your loving and very unhappy sister. And I'll quote here something from Marie that she writes later on. Again, he dies of enteritis again and bronchitis that the doctor, Marie. So she writes this in much later life. I can see his little coffin I still see his little coffin in the office. Mama had put a crown of white roses on him, and she said, looking at him, my God, must he be put in the ground? But since you want it, may your will be done. And you know, it's this that gets Zelie through these deep sorrows of her life. It's her faith and her trust in God and her willingness to do God's will, whatever it may cost her. Without that, I don't know how she could have gotten through what she went through. But that's always the bottom line, even in tears and in great sorrow, but that's her rock. But since you want it, may your will be done. What courage, and that's the right comment that Marie makes. What faith. I was 8, and this sight was profoundly engraved in my heart. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry in the circumstances. And her amazing energy caused everyone to say that she didn't suffer from the death of her children, that her faith was so great that she was happy to give them to God. Poor little mother. Happily, he who sees into hearts saw all her anguish. So that's what people would have seen from the outside. She's active, she's taking care of things, making things happen as they need to happen. And people don't see, you know, her collapsing and just sobbing. They don't see this kind of thing, so much so that they know she's a woman of faith, and they will say to themselves, she has so much faith that she rejoices to see this child with God in heaven for eternity. She doesn't feel sorrow. And so what Maria is saying is exactly the contrary. Of course, she did have that faith, and that was a source of consolation for her. But you can see from the letters that we're reading here, how deeply she suffered, in this case, at the death of the second of her boys and the last of the boys that she would have. That's why when you read the story, there are no boys in it, because Celine, her sister-in-law, has the one boy who is stillborn, and Zelie has the 2 boys, both of whom, as we've seen, die in their first year. So that it's daughters from then on in both families. All right, something else now happens in just days after this. So this is her father, Isidore Sr., and he's living in Alençon. He is 79 years old at this point, and he enters into his last illness and dies actually 5 days after the death of Joseph Jean Baptiste. So she loses her second son and her father in a matter of 5 days. And I just, in the interest of space, I haven't quoted the entirety of the letters here. What's happening is that she and Isidore has come down, and they are taking turns staying with their father in his last days. And they're both at the point where they're exhausted and trying to spell each other. My brother asked me to give you an account of what happened today. He's tired, and I sent him to rest. This morning at 7 o'clock, we both said the prayers for the dying at my father's bedside. At 10 o'clock, he began to feel better. This improvement continued throughout the day, and we hope to save him. He speaks much more freely and is interested in everything. This evening, he's a little worse. The fever returned. I'm afraid of what will happen during the night. Goodbye, my dear sister. As you see, I'm in great pain. This is a sad week for me. My dear little angel, who was so beautiful, had to leave us. I wish with all my heart that you'll never know such sorrow. And my poor father, I'm so afraid of losing him too. She had a difficult relationship with her mother. Her mother was, as we've described, but her relationship with her father was different. And there was a real warm love there. So this is 5 days later now, again to her sister-in-law, Celine. You know the latest loss we have suffered. This morning at 5 o'clock, our good father offered up his soul into the hands of God. And I haven't given all the details here, but it was the death any one of us would hope for, with faith, with the sacraments and prayer. And Zelie was very consoled by the way that he died, even as she felt the sorrow of it. Last night, the fever returned. He had been feeling better all day, and the doctor hoped to save him. I stayed to take care of him until midnight. Our poor dear father suffered horribly, and I shudder just thinking about it. Each breath was an effort. However, I had seen him this bad before, and I hesitated a long time before calling my brother, who so needed his rest. I believed our good father was going to get better, as he had done so many times. And then they switch. Isidore comes and he sends her off to rest. At 5 o'clock, the servant called him to tell him that my father's eyes were lifeless and that he had died. There was still time. They came to look for me, and I was barely able to see his last sigh. I'd been well expecting that the end was quite near, but my heart was broken in sorrow and at the same time full of heavenly consolation. That's almost, I don't know, it's almost a description of Zelie. My heart was broken in sorrow and at the same time full of heavenly consolation. Heavenly consolation, as I say, that's almost a summary of Zelie's life. Where is it here? His grave will be very near that of my two little Josephs. Later, these would all be transferred to Lisieux after the death of Thérèse, when her renown spread. Goodbye, my dear sister. I embrace you as well as your little Jeanne. But each time I intend to speak of her, my heart aches to think of my little Joseph, who was such a handsome and sweet little boy. I had eagerly looked forward to showing him to you, but what can you do? I'm used to sorrow. Let's go a little bit further. So the next is 4 days later. The water. And again to her sister-in-law. As I said, a deep affection develops between the two of them. I'm truly touched by the very affectionate concern you showed me, and I'm grateful to you for it. I'm sorry that poor Isidore is sick. That would be her brother. But he has to be reasonable and resign himself to the will of God. I preach to others, and I'm hardly reasonable myself. That is, be reasonable and resign to the will of God. Saturday, I looked everywhere for my father, and it seemed to me that I was going to find him. You know, we all have, probably most of us here, not all of us, will have lost our parents to God. And I remember that experience after my dad died. And it was maybe the next day or so. We'd done the funeral and everything. And I was in the house together with my mom. And I don't know how it came about, but we wound up putting on some family videos, And at a certain point, of course, my dad was there. And I had this, striking sense that I've never forgotten that he was there, and to my own mind, the experience of losing a parent, especially if the parent, has lived with the Lord and so forth, is one of the clearest, I'd say, proofs. It's not an intellectual syllogism reasoned out, but it's very real. You know that life is not over. And you know it in a way that no one can ever tell you otherwise. And if they ask you to prove it, what you can say is, I know it. And I know it in a way that there's no doubting. And it's something like that, a little bit, that we're getting here in Zelie. I looked everywhere for my father. It seemed to me that I was going to find him. I couldn't imagine that I was going to be separated from him forever. Yesterday, I went to the cemetery. To see me, one would have said, and this is what people saw, here is the most indifferent person in the world. I was kneeling at the foot of his grave and I couldn't pray. My own guess is she's just numb. A few steps away, I knelt by that of my two little angels, the same apparent indifference. I walked along a path that I had taken 5 weeks ago with my little baby and my father. I couldn't tell you all I was feeling. I didn't pay attention to anything happening around me. I looked at the places where my father had sat, and I stood there almost without thinking. Never in my life had I felt such heartache. When I arrived home, I couldn't eat. It seemed as if I would now be indifferent to any misfortune that happened to me. Again, my guess is the heart just can't absorb anymore at this point. If you knew, my dear sister, how much I loved my father. He was always with me. I never left him. And in fact, throughout his life, both of them were in Alençon. He would help me as much as he could. You see that picture of him there, and he looks kind of intimidating. But her experience of him is not that, There's a warmth and a love there. This morning, I received a letter from Elise, so she has learned of the death of her father as well. She told me that at first she cried so much that she lost her voice, but now her soul rejoices in thinking of the grace that God gave us in the holy death of our father, which it really was. And that's like Zelie again, the sorrow and the consolation on the level of faith. Apparently, within the community of the sisters, they're making the Stations of the Cross and offering their communion for the repose of his soul. Okay, Zelie goes through this 4 times. She loses 4 of her children. And I've chosen to go through a set of letters that takes us through one of these. And that's the death of her second son, Joseph Jean-Baptiste. But this will repeat 4 times for Zelie. And we won't go through, again, I just had to make a selection, which was very difficult because every letter has something to say. This is, well, all right, let me just give this. It's out of context, but the slides are here. Yeah, so let's do this. You can see these letters are written in this last letter that we looked at was 1868. And the next that we'll look at takes us to 1870. In the meantime, this is, the family goes through war. France and Germany declare war on each other. This is Bismarck and Louis Napoleon III and so forth, each of them wanting to be dominant in Europe. And the French are utterly crushed in this battle. And these are the seeds of World War I, actually, what happens here. So Germany does not yet exist as we know it today. It's a coalition of states, and Bismarck is about the process of consolidating these into a single and what became very powerful nation. And this war and the complete defeat of the French ends the domination of the French in Europe. If you think up under Napoleon and so forth, that is completely shattered, which leaves a wound. Again, as you can see the seeds of the First World War in all of this. And it is the creation of a unified Germany and the complete humiliation of France. This is not just abstract history, because the Martin family is going to go through this war, and it's going to touch even their very home. So the Battle of Sedan was the crushing defeat, as we say here. The war was really decided at that point. And then a commentary by one of the historians. So their army has essentially been defeated at this point. There's no hope of victory, but they continue to resist. French resistance was carried on against desperate odds by a new government of national defense. Actually, Napoleon III is taken prisoner by the Germans. In Paris, they set up another government, which assumed power in Paris on September 4th, 1870. Léon Gambetta, the leading figure in the provisional government, organized new French armies. And there's some question about Isidore and Louis. Are they going to be part of this? These engaged but could not defeat the German forces. Okay, I just have that there because in the next letter, Louis, this has financial troubles arise for the family. As in the midst of a war, obviously, the businesses are going to be harmed by this. It's not a very cheerful note on which to end, is it? Yeah. But again, saints. All right, we'll end it here.
You've been viewing Hope in Difficult Times with St. Thérèse and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher. To hear and or to download audio recordings from this retreat and so much more from Father Gallagher, visit discerninghearts.com, or you can find them in the free Discerning Hearts app. You can also view other teachings conducted by Father Gallagher by checking out the various playlists listed below. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, which is to offer rock-solid and authentic spiritual formation freely to souls around the world. And if you feel us worthy, please consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible, to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about Discerning Hearts and join us next time for Hope in Difficult Times with St. Thérèse and her family with Father Timothy Gallagher.